Well, the bookstore has arrived, Cecil Brown, so we can now get started. Because we all know publishing these days is exclusively about commerce. I can't think of a more appropriate speaker for the Master of Professional Writing program than A.M. Holmes. This is because our program, as you know, is multidisciplinary, and A.M. has been successful in nearly every literary and not so literary genre. She is a novelist, an essayist, a journalist, a screenwriter, a memoirist, and she's going to talk about the memoir tonight, an art writer for Vanity Fair, and a regular contributor to The New Yorker. I've known A.M. for a long time, since the early 90s, when I was working on that Barbie book. And someone pointed out to introduce us, in fact, because this person believed that we would have a lot in common, since in A.M.'s first collection of short stories, The Safety of Objects, she had this wonderful story called A Real Doll, about a little boy who dates his sister's Barbie. And as he spirals downward by the end of the story, he's given up Barbie, and he's doing something unmentionable in a public context into the hollow body of a Ken doll. One of A.M.'s next novels, The End of Alice, that caused a lot of controversy because she wrote in the voice of a pedophile, also has a really harrowing, it has many harrowing scenes, but one in particular, which again, I cannot describe in a public context, but it takes place in a bathtub. And I myself wrote about this book for Vanity Fair, and I pointed out that A.M. Holmes does for bathtubs what Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho did for showers. Yet another of her recent novels, This Book Will Save Your Life, is set in Los Angeles. And when A.M. gave me a manuscript version of this to read, I took issue with it. It involves a guy who lives in a house and a sinkhole opens in the house. And I didn't think that the geophysics of that were right. I didn't think in Southern California, we have earthquakes, but we don't have sinkholes. Well, A.M. in her extraordinary prescience got that one right too. About 6 months ago in my childhood hometown of La Jolla, California, in fact, in my childhood neighborhood of Mount Soledad, an enormous sinkhole opened up that swallowed up houses. For A.M.'s book that she's going to discuss tonight, The Mistress's Daughter, though, I'm not going to tell any personal stories. I'm going to defer to Zadie Smith, because I think she had something really profound and true to say about this remarkable memoir. And she said, "To my generation of writers, Holmes is a kind of hero, and The Mistress's Daughter is the latest example of her fearlessness and brilliance." Mind you, my generation is not my generation. It's yours. I will continue. It is a compelling, devastating, and furiously good book, written with an honesty that few of us would risk. So I'll be quiet, and A.M. will read and then talk.
Turn on my lovely mic. Danger is always, there was Ellen Kate Foster, who wrote this wonderful book called, is it Ellen? About the foster kid in North Carolina. Anyway, Kay Gibbons is a Southern writer, and she actually once gave a reading. She had the microphone on. She went into the bathroom before the reading and started swearing at herself, not realizing, she was like, yeah, God, horrible, the whole thing. And finally someone knocks on her. I'm like, Ms. Gibbons, we can hear you. So, thank you very much. I actually, doing the research for the last novel, This Book Will Save Your Life, I was here a lot and talking with both earthquake people and science people about geophysics and land masses and so on. I thought what I'd do tonight is read to you from two separate things. One is to read to you sort of a piece from the memoir, which is really a reading piece, And then also to read to you a piece I recently did for an artist in England. One of the things I've been doing lately is moving away from writing standard sort of art criticism and actually writing pieces of fiction in collaboration with artists, trying to find a way in fiction to represent their work. So I've done things with Rachel Whiteread and Cecily Brown, actually with Kathy Opie, who's now a California artist, and lots of different people. And it's been a very fun and interesting thing for me, but it's also so much about trying to find, for lack of a word, language for their imagery, but that's not critical language or academic language, but actually using the structures of fiction. But before we do that, I'm happy also to answer any questions about that or any other kind of writing. I'm also out here because I love this. The writer's strike ended. I finished a pilot that I'm writing for HBO, but there's no president of HBO. No president anywhere, so it doesn't much matter. Okay, so this is from The Mistress's Daughter. Christmas, 1992. I go home to Washington, D.C. to visit my family. The night I arrive, just after dinner, my mother says, "Come into the living room. Sit down. We have something to tell you." My parents are not formal people. No one sits in the living room. "Come into the living room. Sit down," my mother says. "Why?" "There's something we need to talk to you about." "What?" "Come, and we'll tell you. You can just tell me now, from here." "Come," she says, patting the cushion next to her. "Who died?" I ask, terrified. "No one died. Everyone's fine." "Then what is it?" They are silent. "Is it about me?" "Yes, it's you. We've had a phone call. Someone is looking for you." After a lifetime spent in a virtual witness protection program, I've been exposed. I grew up knowing one thing about myself. I am the mistress's daughter. My birth mother was young and single, my father older, married, with children of his own. When I was born in December of 1961, a lawyer called my adoptive parents and said, "Your package has arrived, and it's wrapped in pink ribbons." My mother starts to cry. "You don't have to do anything about it. You could just let it go," she says, trying to relieve me of the burden. "Is the lawyer sure it's the right woman?" I ask. "He's fairly certain it's her. Do you want her name?" I shake my head. "Where does she live?" I ask. "New Jersey." In my dreams, my birth mother has always been a goddess, the queen of queens, the CEO, CFO, COO. Movie star beautiful, extraordinarily competent. She can take care of anyone and anything. She's made a fabulous life for herself as ruler of the world, except for one missing link, me. I call the lawyer. "I'd like a letter," I say. "I want information, where she grew up, how educated she is, what she does for a living, what the medical history is, and what the circumstances of my adoption were. I'm asking for the story of my life. There's an urgency to my request. I have to hurry and ask everything I want to know. And suddenly as she arrives, she could be gone again." 10 days later, her letter arrives with no fanfare. The postman doesn't come running down the street screaming, it's here, your identity has arrived." It comes in a plain envelope from the lawyer's office with a note apologizing for not having sent it to me sooner. The letter is typed on Ellen's stationery, small, simple gray sheets of paper, her name embossed across the top. Ellen's language is oddly formal, less than artful, grammatically flawed. I read the letter simultaneously fast and slow, wanting to take it in, unable to take it in. I read it and then I read it again. What is she telling me? From her letter. At the time I was carrying this little girl, it was not proper for a girl to have a child out of wedlock. This was the most difficult decision of my life to make. I was 22 years old and very naive. I remember being in the hospital with her and dressing her the day we both left the hospital. I've never forgotten the little beautiful black hair and the blue eyes and the dimples in her face. As I left the hospital with the lady who was picking up the little girl, I could still see myself in the taxi and her asking me to give her the baby. I did not want to give her the child. However, I did realize I did not have the wherewithal to take care of her myself. I have always loved this little girl and been tortured every December from the day she was born, but I did not have her with me. Each bit of information swims through me, taking root, digging in. She closes her letter by saying, "I have never married. I've always felt guilty about giving this little girl away." I call the lawyer and ask for another letter, more information, a medical history, what she'd been doing since, and a photograph of her. A day later, in a panic, I call the lawyer again. Oh, I say, I forgot. Could you ask her who the father is? Not my father, but the father. What is his name? Within days, the second letter arrives. From the second letter. I suppose now I should tell you about Norman. This is difficult for me because there's turning back the hands of time. I went to work for Norman at his shop in downtown Washington when I was 15 years old. I worked on Thursday night and Saturdays. During the summer, I worked full-time. Norman, as you know, was much older than I. He was very nice to me. The relationship started innocently. He would offer to drive me home, and we would talk about many things on the way. Then one day he asked if I'd like to go to dinner with him. This was the beginning. At age 17, he called my mother and asked if he could marry me. My mother said she's too young, hung up the phone, turned to me and said, I do not want you to see this man ever again. At this time, I was in love, and nothing she could say would stop me. I've always been a very determined person, stubborn, if you will. Norman is married at that time and promises to get a divorce and marry me. Time goes on. I become pregnant with the young lady. Norman and I start to have disagreements. During the last 3 months of the pregnancy, I stayed with my mother in Virginia. Before the baby was born, Norman again said he would marry me. He asked if he could pick me up and take me to buy things for the baby. I told him no. I did not call him when the baby was born. To the best of my knowledge, he lives in Maryland. He has 4 children. All of his children were born prior to the birth of our child. She ends her second letter. I have a great fear of being disappointed with what I am now doing. I follow up with a phone call. Ellen's voice is low, nasal, gravelly, vaguely animal. I tell her who I am, and she screams, "Oh my God, this is the most wonderful day of my life." Her voice, her emotion comes in bursts like punctuation. I can't tell if she's laughing or crying. The phone call is thrilling, flirty like a first date, like the beginning of something. There's a rush of curiosity, the desire to know everything at once. What is your life like? How do your days begin and end? Why did you come looking for me? What do you want? Every nuance, every detail means something. I'm like a recovering amnesiac. There are things I know about myself, things that exist without language, my hardware, my mental firing patterns, parts of me that are fundamentally and inexorably me, that are being echoed on the other end, confirmed as a DNA match, and it's not entirely a comfortable sensation. Ellen tells me that she loves New York, that her father used to go to the city and always brought back presents. She tells me how much she loved her father, who died of a heart attack when she was 7 because he liked rich food. This causes an immediate pain in my chest. I have to be careful. I could die of a heart attack. Our conversations are frequent. I call a couple of times a week, but I do not give her my phone number. I do not give her my full name. The calls are seductive, addictive, punishing. Each one shakes me and requires a period of recovery. In the middle of one conversation, she interrupts herself. Do you think one day we might have a portrait painted of the 2 of us? The request comes from another world, another life. What would she do with the portrait? Hang it over her fireplace in Atlantic City? Send it to my father for Christmas? Ellen is living in stopped time, filled with fantasies of what might have been. After 31 years, she returned to reclaim a life she never had. I have to go, I say. I'm late for dinner. Okay, she says, but before you go out, put on your cashmere sweater so you don't get chilly. I don't have a cashmere sweater, I tell her. We'll talk again soon, and I hang up. I'm losing myself. On the street, I see people who look alike, families where each face is a nuanced version of the others. I watch how they stand, how they walk and talk, variations on the theme. A few days later, I call Ellen again. In the background, there's a flick, sharp suck of air. She's smoking. Why won't you see me? She whines. You're torturing me. You take better care of your dog than you take of me. Am I supposed to be taking care of her? Don't be angry with me forever, she says. If I'd known where you were, I would have come and taken you away. Imagine that. Kidnapped by your own mother, the same mother who gave you away. I'm not angry with you, I tell her, and it's true. I'm horrified at the way I see myself in her, and appalled that in the end, I may end up rejecting the one person I never had any intention of rejecting. But not angry, not unforgiving. The more Ellen and I talk, the happier I am that she gave me up. I can't imagine having grown up with her. I might not have survived. The day my second novel is published, there's a phone message from my publisher and one from my mother saying she's arranged for brownies at my reading to be in Washington the next day. So this is the editing part. Next day. And a message from the father. It's Norman, he says. I got your letter. Why don't you give me a call when you have a moment? It's been more than a month since I wrote to him, and if the review hadn't appeared in the Washington Post, would he ever have called? If I'd been flipping burgers at McDonald's instead of writing books, would I ever have heard from him? Well, what do you know, he says. He's a swaggering big shot, but there's something to him that I instantly appreciate. Have you spoken to the Dragon Lady lately, he asks? And I assume that he's talking about Ellen. No, I say. Norman is a former football hero and a combat veteran, and for some reason he feels compelled to give me a pep talk. 50 years after the fact, he quotes what Coach once told him about staying in the game and not being a quitter. No one's ever spoken to me this way before, and it's comforting, kind of inspiring. I'll be in Washington tomorrow, I say. Why don't you come meet me at my lawyer's office and we can talk? The next day, the bookstore is crowded with neighbors, relatives, my fourth grade teacher, and friends from junior high. When the reading is over, a line forms, people wanting books signed. In the back, I see a stranger, a woman, standing nervously, twisting an umbrella around and around in her hands. Instinctively, I know it is Ellen. I continue signing books. The line begins to thin, and just after the last person leaves, she steps up. What did you do to your eye? She blurts. You're not behaving, I say. You're built just like your father, she says. Later, when I try to remember what she looked like, I have only a vague memory of green, white polka dots, brown hair piled high on her head. I remember seeing her arm and thinking how small her bones were. In the distance, another shadow emerges. My mother and a friend of hers are coming towards me. I imagine the two mothers colliding. This is something that can't happen. It's entirely against the rules. No one person can have two mothers in the same room at the same time. There are people here whose privacy I have to protect, I say to Ellen. She turns and runs out of the store. The next morning, I take a taxi downtown. At the lawyer's office, I present myself to the receptionist. A man comes through the interior door. I have no idea who he is. Are you Norman? Yes, he says, surprised I don't already know. He shakes my hand nervously and leads me to a large conference room. We sit on opposite sides of a wide table. The father is a big pink-faced man in a fancy suit with a collar pin and a tie. His hair is white, thin, slicked back. We stare at each other. Fine thing, he keeps saying. He's smiling. He has dimples. Having grown up without the refracted reflections of biology, I have no idea whether he looks like me or not. I brought my camera. Polaroid. Do you mind if I take a picture of you, I ask. I take two, and he just sits there flushed, embarrassed. Could I have one of you, he asks, and I allow him to take a picture. It's as though we're making a perverse Polaroid commercial right there in a lawyer's office, a reunion played out as a photo session. We come around the table and stand side by side, watching our images appear. Later, when I show friends the pictures, it's obvious to everyone he's my father. Look at the face, the hands, the ears, they're the same as yours. Are they? Norman hands me a copy of my book to sign, and I autograph it for him to feel like a foreign diplomat exchanging official gifts. Tell me a little bit about you, I say. I'm not circumcised. Okay, maybe it wasn't the first thing he said, but it was certainly the second. Maybe he said, my grandmother was a strict Catholic. She had me baptized. I'm not circumcised. It's strange information to have about your father. What he's really telling me, I guess, is that he's distanced himself from his Jewish half. He goes on to tell tales of his great-grandmother, a 19th century East Prussian princess, and relatives who were plantation owners on the eastern shore of Maryland, slaveholders. He tells me I'm eligible for the DAR. And the Dragon Lady isn't Jewish either, he says. She likes to think she is, but she went to Catholic school. He tells me how beautiful Ellen was when she came to work in the store. When I mentioned the age difference between them, she was in her mid-teens and he was 32, he gets defensive. She was a slut who knew more than her years, things a girl shouldn't know. I ask about their relationship. How often did he see her? Did he ever really think he might leave his wife? He's sweating, stuffed into his good suit. I change the subject. Ellen told me about her father, I say to Norman. She was very close to him, and he died of a heart attack. He didn't die of a heart attack, Norman says indignantly. He was the White House bookie, and he died in a shootout with another bookie. It makes sense. It explains part of the story that Ellen couldn't really explain. Something about men carrying her father into the house, him dying upstairs, and the family having to move into a hotel for a little while. We're winding down. I'm exhausted. I'd like to take you into my family, to introduce you to your brothers and sister, but before I can do that, my wife wants everything to be clear. She wants a test to prove you're my child. Would you consider a blood test? You wouldn't have to pay for it. It's the you wouldn't have to pay for it that throws me. Is this what I get as my big reward, the reparation for all the wrongs of the past, a DNA test? Insulting as it is, on some level I can't blame him. Throwing it all to science might be a good idea. It might make fact out of what feels like fiction. I'll think about it, I say. Fine thing. In the middle of July 1993, Norman and I meet at a blood lab in Washington, D.C. The fluorescent lighting is like an X-ray revealing everything. Norman is there, the only white man in the room. What if we get in there and the nurse is the dragon lady? She'll come out as a square blood-tipped needles, he jokes nervously. I laugh, but it isn't funny. We have a tacit agreement not to tell Ellen what we're doing. What we're doing is insulting to her. As Norman walks up to the counter, I notice that his butt looks familiar. I'm watching him and I'm thinking, there goes my ass. That's my ass walking away. His blue sport coat covers it halfway, but I see it broken into sections, like departments of ass, high and low, just like mine. This is the first time I've seen anyone else in my body. I'm fascinated. I stare as he turns and comes back to me. I look at his shoes, white loafers, country club shoes, stretched out, fading. Inside the shoe, his feet are wide and short. I look up, his hands are the same as mine, square like paws. He's an exact replica of a male version of me. Fine thing, Norman says, seeing me stare. When we're called in, I go first. I roll up my sleeve, the technician pulls on his gloves, assembles his tubes, and ties the rubber tourniquet around my arm. Norman is watching. The needle goes in, sharp metal prick. I've allowed this because I understand the need for proof, for some true measure of our relationship. Please sign here, the technician says, as he hands me the tubes of my blood one at a time. What? You have to sign the tubes. They're warm in my palm, filled with the chemical sum of who and what I am. I signed quickly, hoping not to faint. I'm holding myself in my hands. Norman is next. He takes off his jacket, revealing short shirt sleeves, old guy style. His arms are plump, pale, almost fluffy. I'm suddenly sickened by it all. I wait in the hall. I do not watch him holding his blood or signing his tubes. He comes out of the room, puts his jacket on, and we're out the door. How will you feel if the test comes back and I'm not your father? You are my father, I think. I wasn't positive before, but now, seeing your ass, I'm sure. The heat is stupefying. I walk as though I've been hit with something, blasted. I become a stranger to myself. To be adopted is to be adapted, taken apart and sewn back together again. Whether or not you regain full function, there's always scar tissue, hot spots, flare-ups that take you by surprise. Over the next few months, Norman and I meet several times. We meet in hotels, Holiday Inns, Marriotts, Renaissance Inns, the odd spaces that are between spaces, the there that's never there. We greet each other in the lobby and then move to the glass atrium or the inner courtyard. There's something sleazy about it, meeting in the middle of day in these hotels. You don't know what it does to me to look at you, he says. He doesn't mean the resemblance is amazing or I'm so proud of what you've done with your life. He says it in a lascivious way. He's looking at me and seeing someone else. Norman shifts in his chair. He's always uncomfortable. Injuries, he says, from the war, from football. I can't sit still for long. There's a pause. My wife is jealous of you, he says. I nod. Time passes. Norman leaves me a message and I call him back. I have information, he says. I say nothing. The test results, he says. Do you want to tell me something? Should we meet at the hotel? Sure, I say, but why don't you just tell me what the results are? Everything is fine, he says. Everything is not fine. My patience is running thin. More than wondering if he is or isn't my father, I'm wondering why I keep going back for more. I'll never know the whole story. There's an enormous amount that no one will tell me. I meet him at the hotel. We're at the Fern Bar, the glass atrium. The scene is like something from a science fiction movie, futuristic bioenvironment. I have the results of the DNA test. Yes. The waitress arrives. I'm fine, I tell her. Not even some tea, Norman says. Not even tea. Water, the waitress asks. No. Norman waits until his ginger ale arrives before he says anything. The test says it's 99.9% likely I'm your father. There's a pause. So what are my responsibilities? He asks. I don't reply. Norman doesn't tell me how he's going to take me into his family or give me the large gift behind door number 3. He sips his drink and stares at me. Now that I'm your father, I think I have a right to ask. Are you dating anyone? No. I'm unsure whether I'm answering the question or refusing the answer. Have you told your children? Not yet, he says. I'm wondering if he meets his other children for tea in cheap hotels. We leave without saying goodbye, without a plan for what will happen next. In December of 1997, a week before my birthday, Ellen sends a birthday card. It's pale pink with roses. Dear daughter, this card is being sent early, as I'm not sure I will still be here on the 18th of December. I go to Jefferson Hospital December 4th for a kidney procedure. What the outcome will be, I do not know. I'm very scared. I have chronic renal failure. Jefferson is in Philadelphia. I call Ellen. I canceled the procedure, she says, explaining it was a diagnostic test. She was scared to do it alone. I know that I'm supposed to offer to go with her, but I don't. She asks if I've heard from my father, and I say no. We talk briefly, and I find an excuse to get off the phone. For her birthday the following April, I send flowers. I've done this every year since she found me. This year I get no thank you call. I called the florist to be sure the flowers were delivered. I'm told she sent them back and exchanged them for a plant. It's like about editing. It's also like it's true. But there's nothing else to say after you exchange for a plant. Okay. It's summer 1998. I'm on Long Island in a small rented house. It's early evening, and I'm talking to my mother when her call waiting beeps. She's gone a long time, and I start wondering why. Hold on to your hat, she says, coming back on the line. Ellen is dead. I'm on the phone talking to my mother when she gets a call telling her that my mother is dead. It's a little too much like a Gertrude Stein line. The woman who delivered the news was a friend of Ellen's. I call for more information. She tells me Ellen was in the hospital but checked herself out against medical advice and was found moribund on her sofa. She tells me that Ellen's brother was notified of her death and left Ellen's body in the Atlantic City morgue for 5 days because he was busy at the U.S. Open in Flushing Meadows. He wasn't playing in it, was he? A friend later asks. I call my lawyer and ask him to let Norman know. I drive to Atlantic City with no idea what to expect. The friend said Ellen wanted a Jewish funeral, and instead she got a rented minister in a gray polyester pants presiding over a grave in a really cheap part of an Atlantic City cemetery. Her brother, my uncle, arrives with his wife. Remind me, he says, knowing full well who I am. What's your name? I ask if other relatives are buried in the cemetery. Oh no, he says. The grave is open, waiting, the casket next to it unadorned. I realized I was half expecting a large show of flowers from Norman, perhaps something in the shape of a horseshoe. A couple of months later, I call Norman. It's the first time we've spoken since Ellen's death. He tells me he knew she was sick. The doctor told her she needed a kidney. And according to Norman, Ellen wanted him to ask me for one. He says he told Ellen they couldn't ask me for favors on account of how they'd never done anything for me. I tell Norman that it's enough, that I don't want to get another phone call summoning me to another church where I'll stand in the back and witness friends and family mourning the passing of a man I never really knew. I understand, he says. Call me. Call me in the car. My wife isn't in the car very often. We can talk. I'm not your mistress, say I'm your daughter, and I'm not calling you in your car. Fine thing, he replies. And that's the piece of proof. Maybe it's useful because you have your memoir plus here, just to stop for a minute and talk a little bit about that before I read the other piece. So I'm open to questions. What I can tell you is, unlike other recent memoirs, this one is actually true. And I actually am very interested in the fact that somehow, wherever I go, and even on book tour, people who you think would sort of know better will talk about this book and then say, I'm looking forward to reading your novel, meaning this book. Or people will tell me they're working on a fictional memoir. Like, we lost the whole sense of what the difference is, and also really what the difference is between truth and lying. And I think, as somebody who writes both fiction and nonfiction, I know the difference. And as I'm writing it, I know the difference. When I'm writing a story that really comes from my imagination, I absolutely know where the kernels are that come from real life or observed life versus the pieces that come out of my imagination. And when writing nonfiction, and especially memoir, because memoir is different than writing, a magazine article. I also know, as you're writing it, you feel, and this happens a lot when writing nonfiction, you feel the story bending because you are writing a story. It is a construction. But you have a mandate to yourself, in theory, unlike reality, to really constantly pull back and think about what is the chronological order, what are the facts, what is the structure I'm working with, and how do I best represent the truth, or the observed truth, or the experienced truth. Because obviously there is no real truth, but it's all, what I'm saying. Anyway, so we can talk about that if people have questions. I found it to be very interesting. Sure.
Well, I mean, this book, it spans years of your life. And so at what point did you realize that this was going to be a book, or this was going to be a story you were going to tell? Sure. And then when you went back, was it hard to sort of remember some of those early details?
The thing that also for me was a good checkpoint in terms of accuracy is as this was happening, I made notes, because my way of dealing with anything is to just make notes. I mean, it's like, the worse life gets, I have to write it down, because it's just, I don't know how else to it's like making a grocery list, like people being mean to me. Anyway, so I had all these notes, and I early on wanted to write it, if only to sort of document the story and really write the shape of the story as it happened. And I was also very aware of the fact that other things in life also happen, and not that a story changes, but your emotional position in relation to it changes. So I wanted to really hold it where it was and where it had happened. So I wrote 100 pages of this book, and I actually gave it to someone who was very important in my publishing life, who hated it. And I'd never had that happen, and it was a strange thing, because not only did she hate it, it was sort of like that she hated me. It's like, it was all true. She's like, the story is so raw, and it's so unprocessed, and can't you go back and do more like what Martin Amis is doing and writing about his father, and kind of, elaborate on things or something? And I sort of thought about that. I stopped. I really just stopped. And I put it away. And I had a contract from the New Yorker for this, which also occurred in a very strange place, because I had gone to lunch with an editor for the New Yorker, and it was the strangest meal I've ever had, because I didn't get to eat. The guy, I think, almost it was as though he stuck his hand down my throat, was rooting around for a story that was somewhere, in my stomach, and he's just like, I'm going to find something during this lunch. And it was a horrible lunch. It was really horrible. And I sort of told him a little bit about the story, and he said to me at the end of it, that's interesting. That's, I like that. I like that one idea you have. So, your life is an idea you have. Thanks. Great. He said, if you ever think you want to write about that, maybe just type up a little proposal for me. I'm thinking, as if I would say, dude, that was the proposal. You're not getting anything more. There is no piece of paper for it. That was it. And I just thought, jerk. I went home and ate lunch. Probably had 10 cookies and, the usual. And then I get this phone call from my agent saying, it's so weird about your lunch today. Why? Well, Tina Brown and Cy Newhouse were having lunch at the table opposite you, and apparently they were watching the whole lunch. And when the editor got back to the New Yorker, Tina, who was then the boss of the New Yorker, said to him, I don't know what you were talking about. Whatever it was, you better sign that up this afternoon. So that was like that. So I had this contract. I never gave them the piece. I never did anything about it. I had the 100 pages, and I just stopped. And every now and then I would say to myself, I want to just finish it for myself. I want this document. I don't care if I publish it. I don't care about the New Yorker. And I would work on it a little bit, and then I would just get upset. I would just think, this is horrible and hard, and obviously it's no good. And people knew that there was something I was working on, and it sort of existed. And then a few years ago, Granta actually called me and said, we're doing this anthology on adoption. We know you have something, and can you give us something for it? And I thought to myself, come on, Holmes. There's got to be something in those 100 pages that's okay. And I took it out and I read it, and I thought, it's so interesting. I wouldn't write this any differently. It is what it is. And that to me also meant that it really was true, that there was not a different way I was ever going to tell the story, that was the story. And if it was a, quote, bad story, then it was a bad story. And I'm a bad storyteller, my life stinks. So I sort of smooshed it up, because you're allowed, even though it's your own life, so you can smoosh it more. And I was just about to hand it in to Granta, and all of a sudden I had this dim recollection, don't I have a contract with the New Yorker? And so by then, the New Yorker had a new editor, and I called my agent. I said, don't I have a contract with the New Yorker? And sure enough, the New Yorker was still interested. So then I had done this horrible thing where I had now done all this work for Grant. I had promised it to them. And sure enough, the New Yorker wanted it. So I sort of gave Grant like the debris that was left over. I gave the piece to the New Yorker. And then people kept talking about, oh, the book came out of it. But it didn't. It was always going to be this thing. But the one thing that did happen was it kind of gave me the strength in the sense that it really was surprisingly debilitating to me to have someone hate what I had done. And I think had it been a piece of fiction, it wouldn't have been so bad, but because it was so personal. So I went and I finished what I had done, and I also really wanted the second half of the book not to be an extension of the narrative, but really to almost like take a sledgehammer and like crack it open and see what was inside that. Because I was thinking a lot about identity and how we all sort of unknowingly, whether forget about being adopted, but just buy into a family story. You ask your parents, where'd you come from, where'd you meet, and we think that's true. And it's so funny because now, being in this business of writing, it's a narrative. It's just a story. It's like a thing that, 4 people in your life agreed on, and all of a sudden it's how you define yourself. And I hadn't really thought that much about that. I thought that was interesting, so I started writing about that, and that's sort of how it ultimately got finished. But, talking 10 years. Anyone else have a question? Those 10 years.
How aware were you when you were writing the book, not just of how you're presenting your family, but how you were presenting yourself?
It's a good question. I mean, I felt like for me, it's funny, everyone always describes me as A.M. House, the novelist, as an passionately private person. I don't really know what that means. I growl at people or something. I'm not somebody who, by nature, when I write fiction, I really am not writing autobiographically. I do something that apparently doesn't exist anymore. I make things up, knowingly, consciously. And I don't really write about myself. I get enormous amount of pleasure from taking on someone who's very, very different from myself. So writing a book in which I was the main voice and the main character in some way was not my first choice, but I felt that in some ways, more than writing about myself, I was writing about people I never knew, my biological parents, and a life I never had. And that was kind of, as a writer, that was to me the more interesting thing, and thinking about them and thinking about how this all came to be, and also really thinking about the oddity of, this is when I cracked it open, I started looking at how people in my adoptive family came to this country, how my biological parents came to this country and their families, and realizing that, I am not just the product of my biological parents or my adoptive parents. It's a historical sequence that goes back, and that was super interesting because it really becomes about world history and why people immigrated at a certain point in time, how they get here, and hundreds of decisions that people made that resulted in me being born in 1961 and being taken from one family and given to another, which was a kind of a cool thing, and again, just a much larger kind of social idea. So that was, an interesting piece of it. The one kind of conscious decision I had was I didn't write an enormous amount about my adoptive family. They're in the story, but I felt that I wasn't trying to write their story, and also I have a very close relationship with them, and I wasn't interested in trying to sort of, they're alive, I talk to them every day. It wasn't so much about them, and that was the only kind of, conscious kind of shaping of something in that sense. But beyond that, I just thought, not like all bets are off, but it's also interesting because it's not the entirety of my life. The memoir represents a slice and a distinct event in my life that obviously is a big shape of my identity, but it's really one piece, so I don't feel totally naked. Just happy.
Did investigating your biological family have any impact on your decision to become a mother?
No. I think it would be like a warning not to, actually. But no, I always really wanted to have kids, and I just had that thing where I was getting older and older. And I have to say, it is very, very interesting now to have a biological relative who lives with me. And it is like, and I had these moments where I'm thinking, I know what you're thinking, because I can just see the little tape go by. And not that she's identical, but, there's a real similarity. And growing up, I didn't have that. I didn't have that similarity. I can tell you that my mother never knew what I was thinking. It was good and bad, but, very, very different. And I think, if anything, people kept always saying to me, like, was it cathartic to write a memoir? As though, like, is vomiting fun? It's like, having a surgical wound that you have to clean every day fun. It was incredibly, incredibly painful. And I really felt, obviously, like I wanted to do a good job. And I've always had the same, even when I was writing The End of Alice, which was a very dark book that was not autobiographical, was not to run away from difficult material. So I had that same standard for this. So at the end, I don't think it felt like therapeutic or cathartic. I think it was like sort of exhausting. And, the joke is that last year I went on book tour, and I was still on tour for the California novels. So it's going to be like California Pizza Kitchens, where they sell pages of my novel. I want with my cheese on it or whatnot. But I went all over the U.S. and Europe with the memoir, and I really felt it was like one of those. You saw these posters up in New York about vivisection, which is like animal medical torture, and the monkeys there are like cut open. I felt like that was the book tour. It was like going around from everywhere in the United States to then Heidelberg and Zurich and whatever, being asked in every language the same questions about your childhood and yourself, as though at some point if they shook you hard enough, more would fall out. And I thought, I really can't wait to go back to writing fiction, because I said what I had to say, and it wasn't like I kept something. There was sort of nothing more. It was exhausting.
Will it be dramatized?
The funny thing is, it could be dramatized. Interestingly, when you write a story like this, when they talk about the film rights, there's a big concern always that somebody in the book would sue them. So there's some concern that one of my biological relatives could sue a film company. And then stranger yet, I had these meetings with Bill Condon, who did, Dream Girls and Gods and Monsters, and he wanted to do a film of it, and he somehow wanted me in the film. And I thought, oh, that idea. It's like, it's one thing to have lived your life once already. It's another thing to, like as though like a scene would be this, So let's just say that's something.
Be Natalie Portman.
Well, yes, Natalie, yes, and there was Natalie Portman did want to play me, and I thought that's okay. That would work, but yeah.
So will we all actually be in that movie as well?
Yes, you're all. In fact, it's happening now. You didn't sign the release when you came.
No, I had a real question though.
Sure.
As far as like the difficulty of writing and exposing yourself,
Yeah.
I feel like learning to write memoir is somewhat, you have to kind of distance yourself enough to get through a sentence, and so you're dealing with like, if you were writing a fictional character, you would give them the vulnerability in their voice, but you can't always do that when it's you, because you have to get through what you're doing at the same time. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying, and I would say that's a reason to write fiction, because I think if you're struggling with that, and you can get accuracy and a kind of depth or honesty in the fiction that you can't get in the memoir, because there is, logically it makes sense to not want to like embarrass yourself or completely expose yourself or whatever, and that there are very good reasons to use lived experience as the stuff of fiction. That said, I think that when you're writing a memoir, one of the hardest pieces of it is to force yourself not to run away from it and to go ahead and say the thing. And you have to realize, the first deal that you make with yourself is, number one, you're not obligated to ever publish it. You're obligated to do the best job you can do to tell the story. And that's your first job. And that has nothing to do with your family. It has nothing to do with what anybody that you know knows about you. It's just the deal with yourself as a writer, is to write as well and honestly and good as you can. So I think you have to always return to that. And also, I always talk about it in terms of, in fictional terms, as writing the truth according to the character. But obviously, if you're the character, it's also representing the truth as best you can. And it is scary. I think for me also with this book, there's a huge benefit for me, which is that I had written 9 books before this. So there's a couple of differences, because a lot of people who write a memoir have not already written a book. So I had all that practice writing and all that practice learning how to shape a story and build a story and all of the kind of concrete elements. And also I've written very, difficult fiction. So I've written fiction that people find horribly upsetting and scary and threatening, and I've been banned in other countries and here. So I'd already sort of taken those risks in a sense, and I didn't feel so worried about that. And I'd already dealt with, we have all these sort of running jokes in my family where when the end of Alice was coming out, the publisher called me and said, we're going to print a lot of copies of your book. That's good news, right? So I call my mother and go, Mom, they're going to print a lot of copies of my book. She goes, really, why? And then another time, it's like lovely familial support. And I said, Mom, do you understand what I'm saying? She's like, yeah, I do. I just can't imagine why anyone would want to read a book like that. And then another time my dad said something about the same book. And he said something like, so that film fella liked your book, because John Waters had called him. And I said, yeah, he did. And he's like, yeah. And he goes, and some other folks like it. And I went, yeah, they do. And he said, and you feel pretty good about it, right? And I said, well, yeah, Dad, I do. I feel like I worked really hard on it, and it was a really difficult book. He's like, well, you're entitled to your opinion. It's just, it's also, it just is what it is. But I just like, whatever. I think it's so difficult because you can't do a good job as a writer and invest in what anybody's going to think. You know what I mean? Because obviously when you're a student and you're working and you're taking in, criticism and ideas from people in a workshop or in a class, that's one thing. And you sort of learn to sort of whose opinions to value or whose feel valid for you. But I think you can't worry about what the larger world is going to think. I mean, I don't ever think about what is a critic going to think, because you know what? They're all going to hate me. I mean, and even if they love you, that's bad for you too. I mean, it's all a head game. So I always just really focus on getting my work done and trying to figure out what that means. Someone else had another question.
Oh, I did, sure. Do you think being adopted made you a writer? Do you think if you were raised by the Dragon Lady, you still would have been a writer? Or
I really fear had I been raised by her, I would be dead. I mean, I don't mean that lightly. It was interesting to, it's not like a typical story that every person who is found by a biological relative or finds one, the person turns out to be completely crazy and insane. I really think she did a good thing. That said, I don't think that being adopted made me a writer, although I've had these conversations with Edward Albee, who's also adopted, and Richard Howard, the poet. I think I always felt on the outside, and I really was an outsider, and I think there always was a sense for me of there being a space between me and the rest of the world. And in that space, a lot of observation occurred. So it was, in some ways, easier for me to write about things than participate in them. And it definitely, it affects me profoundly. So that's on the one hand, I can't escape that ever, but I don't think it made me a writer. The other thing that's interesting is, in my biological family, I mean, there's one of my father's children wants to be a writer, which is a funny thing. He's like, maybe you should read his work. He really wants to be a writer. I'm like, you know what? No. You won't tell them that I exist, but I should read their work. What do you mean? It's like, sneak it to me, I'm going to sneak you comments back. Like, some ghost left this note for you in the night. But anyway, in my adoptive family, there actually are other writers, which is interesting. And I don't know how that happens, but that family really values art and writing and, a life of the mind. And the other family values shoplifting. I'm trying to think what else. It's not pretty, but anyway, it's funny. There are a lot of gamblers in that family. There was the White House bookie. There also was some true math whiz who taught at Stanford for a long time and at Princeton. But I remember once as a young person going to the racetrack and having that funny feeling like I could really get into this before I really knew the history. And then it turned out, I think literally some of them, my mother was arrested for taking bets for football games or some crazy thing. So there are little threads that run through you. I'm going to read you this piece. It looks just like writing on a page. And then if there are other questions, I can answer those as well. So this is the piece about Sarah Jones, and what I'll tell you is that, I may have already said this, but she's been doing this series of photographs of analysts' couches, and her work, she's English, her work is very kind of, in a way, formal and very sort of measured. She thinks a lot about things, about memory and history. She's done a lot of photographs of girls that seem to be sort of hiding under furniture, and they're very, these sort of fixed moments in time. And this is the piece I wrote for her for a show she just had at the National Media Museum in England. Whose story is it, and why is it always on her mind? She's seeing the doctor now. It was a condition. I should also add, just before I could, Part of the series that she just finished also is a series of photographs of what are called the common roses of England, and they are the roses that are in all the parks all over England. So just keep them. She's seeing the doctor now. It was a condition of her release. The thorns, he asks? Yes, she says. Plucked from rose stems, she drove the thorns deep into her skin, pressing them like shark's teeth in a line up and down her arms. She pressed the thorns into her skin until the skin gave way and buried the thorn. And then she took off her shoes and pushed the thorns into her feet and walked from park to park, carefully collecting more thorns. Specimens, she called them. Her wounds became infected. The infection spread into her blood. We almost lost you, her mother said. I was right here the whole time, hiding in plain sight. I see you're walking with a limp, the doctor says. I'm treading lightly. Why thorns? It runs in the family. She glances over her shoulder to see if the doctor is listening and catches him off guard. Their eyes meet and she looks away. Continue, the doctor says. She lies back, her fingers stroke the deep blue fabric on the doctor's couch. My mother rearranges the furniture constantly, she says. She's trying to make something that she remembers, but I'm not sure it ever happened. She says she's getting closer. She's no longer young, but she gathers the energy to push the sofa around the room, and when she's done, she cries. It will never be the same again. It is always almost there, but not quite. She can't put her finger on it. The light, the silence. Every day she tries a new combination, hoping the pieces will fall into place like the pin tumblers of a lock, hoping there will be an opening and something will be revealed. Where are you going with that? I ask as she moves the lamp from this table to that. I am going back where I came from, she says. But it does not exist, I say. She makes still lives, tableaus of how she wishes it were. Is this the same sofa, she asks, the one from before? That's what you've always told me. I don't know anymore, she says. Maybe it came after the fact. She calls the war the fact. My mother's sofa is also blue. Finished for today, she gets up carefully. The next time she visits the doctor, she notices a hair. She sees it as she's approaching the doctor's couch, a blonde hair like a golden thread glinting in the light. She doesn't know what to do. Pick it up, stretch it between her fingers, and pluck it like the string of a harp. She imagines winding it round and round a finger until the finger turns blue, or pressing it against her neck like a fine gold wire. What to do? She pretends not to see it. She lies down on it, the blonde hair beneath her own brown hair, the blonde hair becoming for a time part of her, but she can't bear it. Whose hair is it? Does the doctor have sex on the sofa? My mother was born the day before the war ended. She was a girl without a father, a miracle. For a long time she believed that. We all did. The fact is, during the war, my grandmother was left in a Catholic boarding school. Her parents brought her there in the middle of the night, turned their backs, and left. As she screamed for them, the nuns held their hands over her mouth. The way the story goes, he appeared in the garden behind the school. She pretended not to know what happened, but it's possible she really didn't know. It was a war. She was terrified they would die. The only thing that kept her sane was that the roses kept blooming. That's where they found her, entangled in rose bushes. He came into the garden, bent to smell the roses, and saw her. He pushed her into the bushes. When he was gone, she remained trapped. She lay in the garden all night. She watched the sky go dark, the stars come out. She looked up into the blue, the unending, the unnameable. She was asleep when they found her. Grandmother woke up, but only partially. It was as if she was under a spell, in a fog. Sometimes she would come out from under, but mostly she seemed baffled, like it all just didn't make sense. As a child, my mother knew that her mother hated her, but she didn't know why or what she'd done wrong. My mother kept herself hiding in boxes, under the table, inside closets. She would pretend she was invisible. Later, she would hide in the woods behind trees or in piles of leaves. She would play chameleon and practice shifting her skin to match the environment. When other children came to play, my mother would hide, and only after they left would she rush to the window, press her face to the glass. My mother found out when she was 13. She doesn't remember how, but she said it explained a lot. When she found out, she went on a nighttime rampage through all the parks of London and cut the roses. She brought back hundreds of roses. She filled my grandmother's house with roses from bud to bloom to past their prime. cabbage rose, common rose, tea rose, each with delicate petals like human flesh, each with a perfume, a beautiful scent from putrid. The theft of the roses was a crime. The roses belonged to the city, to the people, not just for the benefit of one. The story of the theft made all the papers, and her mother was horrified and threatened to turn her in. I can't have this. It's too much. You're doing it to me again. You're just like your father. You are the proof you can't escape your history. And together they cut the roses and their long, thorny stems into tiny little pieces and boiled them down. She pauses. Does anyone have a life of their own? She asks the doctor. He doesn't answer. Her third visit is very different. There's something on the sofa like a doily or a napkin covering the little pillow. Is the hair still beneath it? Is it being hidden, kept safe? She lies back and says nothing. She looks at the room, the light through the windows, a lamp, part of a painting, an extra chair, and a table with a plant. She's thinking of her mother moving furniture, of her grandmother trapped in the roses. She stares at the plant, a beautiful white and purple orchid, and wonders, did the doctor buy it or receive it as a gift? Is it real? She asks him. Does it look real? The doctor answers. When the session is over, she sits up. The room spins, kaleidoscope blurring. She falls back onto the sofa. Your time is up for today, the doctor says, but she cannot get up. The doctor seems flummoxed. This has not happened before. He goes to his desk, rummages through a drawer, and finds a tin of hard candy. He offers her one. It is red and in the shape of a rose. She sucks the sugar. The sucre works wonders. She dreams she is walking on water, and it is raining rose petals. If you Google Sarah Jones, it'll all make sense. But I'm happy to answer other questions or talk about other things about writing the new tax code.
I have a question about the editors that you have chosen, or
Sure.
that choose you.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and from the 9 books that you wrote that were fiction, or primarily fiction,
Yeah.
to one that's a memoir, did you choose different editors for this, or did you have...
It's a good question. I have had the weird experience that I would not recommend, and were I to do it over, I would do
Should I
it
take
differently.
notes on your experience?
I've had a lot of editors, and part of it is that I had this infamous agent, Andrew Wiley, otherwise known as the Jackal. Anyway, early on in my career, my first novel, Jack, which I wrote when I was 19, it's about a boy who's growing up whose dad is gay, and somehow no one was allowed to buy this book because it was written from the point of view of a young person, a 14-year-old, and was it a children's book or was it an adult book? And everyone loved it because we can't buy it. So ultimately, it was sold to a woman named Alice Turner, who was actually the fiction editor at Playboy, a job at Scribner. And she bought it along with a woman named Judith Whipple, who I'm convinced was married to Mr. Whipple, this Charmin squeezing guy, because they decided they were going to publish it as both a children's book and an adult book. And I said, one of my concerns is that there not be a drawing of the boy on the cover, because I always think you want to imagine the person, you don't want someone to show you what the person looks like. No problem. We have a person who's doing a lot of psychiatric art lately. Great. Can't wait to see that. It's like Edward Monk for teenagers. And then Mrs. Whipple called me, Judith. And there were some swear words in the book. Yeah. They're still in the book. So that book came out, and it did perfectly well, but it was really pretty much published as a children's book or as a young adult book. And it took a year for the first review to come out in the New York Times. And somebody actually called me and said, there's a review of your book in the paper this weekend by Crescent Dragonway. And I thought, that's funny, ha ha ha. Totally serious. And they're like, no, it's a really nice review of your book. Crescent Dragonwagon is apparently a well-known writer who I had not heard of, but wrote a very nice review of the book a year after it came out, which is fine. And then it was time to sell the paperback rights, and Mrs. Whipple wanted to sell them to a children's publishing company. And at the same time, Vintage, who's part of Random House, who did that great vintage contemporary series, also wanted the book. And I actually had to pay the publisher $1,000 to not sell it to children's publishing. This is the inside story publishing. And agreed with to an unequal now permanent split of any royalties, because that was whatever. So fine. So then I left that publishing company and I went to Norton, who published The Safety of Objects. And they had a cover for The Safety of Objects that looked like kind of homemade, black and white, kind of weird Eastern European like art, like as though they'd run out of supplies. And it didn't look right. And I said something like, you know, I went literally to the store, and I didn't have a lot of money there. I went to the art supply store, and I bought 3 pieces of paper, but 3 colors, purple, orange, and red. Because I thought, and I made a cover that weekend. And I said, yeah, I just want to, like, what you could do. And I made the cover. That is the cover. I would have picked maybe a 4th color, or gone, you know, whatever. So then I left there after that book because I had an editor who's still a very prosperous, well-known editor who used to routinely just randomly call me and yell at me. And I would call my agent and say, Eric, this guy is calling me and yelling at me. It's like, that's not possible. And you're just, don't do that and just whatever. And years later, he called me up and apologized. I'm so sorry. I thought he was making it up or exaggerating. Now I've heard he yells at everybody. Then I went to Knopf for Country of Mothers. So there you are at Knopf. You think, hey, that's, you know, that's the #1 publisher. Yeah, and then Knopf, we gave them the first 100 pages of The End of Alice, and they promptly turned it down. And then my agent called me and yelled at me as though it was my fault. And I finished the book, and it was, in a way, it was sort of a good thing because it really made me work hard on the book. And instead of sort of freaking out, it made me really commit myself to not being afraid to do anything because I thought, oh, bets are off. And so I wrote The End of Alice, and we sent it out to publishers. It was right after American Psycho had come out and been, as I put it, been arrested. The book itself had been arrested, and a lot of publishers wanted to buy the book, and the heads of the houses wouldn't let them buy it because they were afraid of what would happen. So finally, Nan Graham, who had been at Viking, had now gone off to Scribner. Same publisher where Mrs. Whipple, who I think had recently probably died. I didn't have anything to do with that. And Nan bought it and published The End of Alice. And it came out and got enormous amounts of attention, good and bad. And I thought that was okay. And they were very freaked out by the bad. And just, you know, this isn't a book that you're supposed to love. It's not like, it's scary to me. Sometimes I love The End of Alice. It's like, why? I mean, it's a book about like a jailed pedophile murderer. Or people say, we have something in common. It's run. I mean, people say that to me. It was terrifying. So then after that book, which did very well for them, they basically, I don't know, they kind of didn't want to pay me for the next book, even though that book had been like a bestseller and sold lots of copies. So then I left again. It's like a horrible thing. We then leave again. Now, publishing is shrinking very rapidly. We're trying like a little map. So the good news is I've never had a fight with any of these people, but it's getting smaller and smaller. And then, I don't remember what came after The End of Alice. Oh, I know what it was. Music for Torching, right?
Yeah, that was.
So Music for Torching sent out to a lot of people. Rob Weisbach, very lovely young man. Andrew Wiley, the Jackal, gets the offers for this book. And I said, do you think I ought to go meet him before we agree to this? He goes, no. Just take the check. No. So I go and I meet him. He's a very nice guy. But shortly after that book comes out, he loses his position at his publishing company, and it's folded into HarperCollins, where a friend of mine works. But then my friend becomes my editor. He subsequently dies. I suddenly have no editor. This guy, Dan Maneker, who's a very good editor, comes in, and luckily we got along very well. So he did Things You Should Know, and he was about to do the next one. This book will save your life, I think. And then he left and went. It's just what happens. He left and went somewhere else. There was no one working there anymore. And so I went back to where Nan Graham had started, which was Viking, to a guy named Paul Slovak, who's been in publishing for a very long time. And he is an interesting guy. He used to run the publicity department. He now is one of the people who runs the company, and he publishes William Bowman, who's a very difficult writer. Also people like William Kennedy. He's a very literate guy who also publishes poetry, which is not heard of anymore. And so I didn't have a real question, actually, to answer your question about doing fiction or nonfiction. There are some editors who really seem to be exclusively one or the other. For me, it really is about being with people. What I've realized is I want the process to be one that I can enjoy, because publishing is not what it was. It's not we're not growing that many new readers. The readership is sort of staying the same in this country, but it's obviously it's getting older, but it's not a good business. I mean, it's a horrible business. So at least you should enjoy the people that you work with. Longest answer to your question. And good morning. Does anyone else have a question?
Well, you mentioned it right when you started, but with all the negativity surrounding the memoir, how do you, I mean, does that affect the way you think of yours, or affect your option of writing another one, or just even the publishing?
It's a very good question. It doesn't affect anything about my memoir because I know that my memoir is true. It concerns me on the larger scale because people keep saying, people outside of publishing say things like, why don't publishers fact check? Now, publishing a book is very different than publishing a magazine article, and actually the New Yorker did fact check. And when the New Yorker fact checked, when I ran the piece with them, they had 32 questions to ask my biological father. They were very specific. Perhaps you can think of what some of them might have been. Yeah. And interestingly, in that New Yorker piece, I hadn't even named my father. I actually had given him and my biological mother other names. It was a decision that came later to actually use their real names after the New Yorker piece. But the New Yorker has a very high standard for fact checking. And it was terrifying. But publishers, it's not a piece of reportage in the sense that they will look at it from a legal point of view of how they might be legally exposed or who could sue them for libel and things, but they're not checking point by point your facts. And I think it's a problem when the larger world doesn't sort of know what the responsibility chain is. You know, you as the writer are responsible for how you present yourself to the publisher. I think it's bad in the overall sense that somehow why this young woman in Oregon published her book as a memoir, why wasn't it good enough to just say she was a great novelist, that she made up this great story, she thought of this wonderful character? It's as though, like, the world of fiction, which traditionally has been incredibly illuminating of how we live our lives, we study fiction, literature, all those things, suddenly that's no longer valid, and we only believe in a fact-based culture. But I think we've really lost really knowing what fact-based is, because whether it's, you know, we see photographs of things and we forget that they're subjective and, you know, how the photograph was made or whatever. It's a really interesting conversation that I think has to be had publicly by an ongoing sort of group of people about the difference between fact and fiction. And you know, in this memoir, there are moments where I say, I imagine, because I'm very clear about if I am ever thinking about something that is coming from my mind's eye as opposed to what I know, I take responsibility for saying, I imagined my father, blah, blah, blah. Because I want the reader to know that I'm not, you know, can't prove you that way, and stuff like that. So I think it doesn't change it for me. In terms of writing another memoir, I've forgotten everything. No, I really like fiction. I feel like I am most useful at that. I think that this book, the reason I finally finished it and sort of launched it out in the world was I felt like it would have meaning for other people. It was incredibly painful for me, and I'm happy that it's out there, but I don't really need to do it again, you know. And I like writing nonfiction, but nonfiction or writing about an idea I may have or an essay on something is very different than, you know, sort of dredging your insides and especially for this, because it really was also about finding language for a very primitive sort of emotional experience. So, no, I'm not. Anyone else? Well, thank you guys so much for.
Well, wait a minute. No, you haven't. I was. Yes. No. I'm just.
Yes.
I know at one point you were adapting In a Country of Mothers. Can you talk about some of the challenges of adaptation, and also in terms of industries being difficult, perhaps compare, say, writing for a cable series with publishing books?
Sure, absolutely. Where would you like me to begin? I say writing for a cable series, what MJ is referring to as I wrote for the L Word for 2 years. It was enormously fun, because you don't have to think. Because, oops, I misspoke. It was a whole thing where you sat in a room with other people and they fed you snacks all day. Now, as a novelist, you sit like alone in your underwear and nobody talks to you all day. So to be in a room, you know, where you get to essentially play and be fed, it was like going back to like daycare. And I found it honestly very stimulating because you're making up stuff and bouncing it off of other people. It's a very instantaneous response. And it's a very fast medium. You're working fast to make these scripts and do these things. Unlike a novel where you really want it to be good. You're, you're working sort of within a time clock, but you don't fully own any of it. It's not really your work, and it's very much a collaborative effort, and that was a lot of fun and kind of a relief because it's a very different sort of process, and I liked it a lot. Now I'm doing this thing of coming up with my own series for HBO, and I would say that's harder because you sort of have to come up with the whole thing, and it's a lot like coming up with a whole novel and a whole world, and yet the first thing you're giving them is only like, it's like you have to write the whole novel secretly, but you can only give them the first 50 pages. So my first draft of my script was like 7,000 pages. I'm like, showed it to a friend. He's like, yeah, you're gonna have to edit that down a little bit. It's hard work if you're doing your own thing. In terms of adapting stuff for film, I actually did the adaptation, and I don't think the film turned out well at all for a variety of other reasons, of Jack, my first novel. And originally people had asked me to do adaptations of things, and I said no, because often if you've just finished writing the novel, it is a very different thing to write a novel, and you have to think about what is a film and what is a novel, and they're not the same, and the terms are different. I think that's one of the things why I like working in lots of different formats, why I like doing nonfiction art criticism. I like not just learning the shape of the different things, but I like that there are different things you do, that when you're writing a piece that's like for theater or live performance, because you have a physical real person, you represent language differently than when you have to write a novel and literally move the person into the building and across the stage and all of those things. Film is like that too, that you have the backdrop behind you, so you just have to kind of get them there and get from scene to scene. With Jack, it was fun for me because I hadn't talked to Jack in probably 20 years. And the funny thing was I did it for, it was Showtime, wasn't it? No, was it Showtime? It's one of those cable people. It was. And I wrote the script, and I'm like, God, this is so cool. You put some new things in here. It's not like if you were a writer, like you would never put like a new line in your own, 20 years later. And it was a lot of fun, and it was also a process, and I felt like I learned a lot about collaboration. What I also learned is that very often they'll tell you to take something out without realizing that it's the most key piece of the entire script. And then when you remove it, it all falls apart. So that you have to learn how to pretend to take things out, but kind of still leave them in there. Because it's like they'll say, like, I really like that car. Can you make it into a helicopter by this afternoon? And you go, sure, I'll just take out the engine, and, but it was interesting. And in terms of Country Mothers, I did an adaptation for. My favorite story, Country Mothers, if anyone knows, anyone who wants to buy a book for film, it's available again. It's on sale. But it's one of those books that there's a $1 million Ron Bass screenplay, there's a $26,000 A.M. Holmes screenplay, and there's a few in between. So it's like many, many versions of it. And I think it's a book that actually really is a good film. It has a very filmic story, but it'll be interesting to see what happens now as it goes sort of around again. It's different when you. I think in the future, if I was to do things, I don't really need to adapt my own work to film, because I think if I want to do that, I should just write a film. Do you know what I mean? Rather than take I think I'd like to start adapting either other people's work or just writing some sort of original film.
Does the Jackal handle you in Hollywood?
The Jackal does not handle me, because the Jackal doesn't handle Hollywood. Because he thinks film is shit, actually. if you say to him, you want to do more films, he'll say film is shit. It's Jackal.
Has anyone adapted your work?
Well, yeah, I mean, Safety of Objects, Rose Troche, which is, it's interesting, it's a collection of short stories, and she actually made it into a single narrative feature that came out a few years ago. Jack was on Showtime and is on, DVD now. And Steve Shainberg, who made Secretary of Fur, is making music for Torching, if they ever get a script that they like. They've had a series of them. And somebody's working on This Book Will Save Your Life. They're all, whatever. They're all in various stages of stagnant. Stages of stagnancy. It's not a word. Maybe it's like the sediment thing in the bedrock. They study the earthquake things. maybe those are all really screenplays that piled up now. And it's going to be a true thing of California. It's going to turn out the next time they like excavate after an earthquake, they're going to see just hundreds of years of screenplays. You know? And they weren't printed on acid-free paper. They were printed on really cruddy paper, and it just, crumbled.
That's a nice upbeat way to
Well,
end.
No, it's fun, but I have to say, if when I come out here and I have these meetings, they're always sending you to meet people, and no joke, one time they did send me to meet someone in a closet, and I'm not making it up. The guy had some guy, like, and they said, go to here, go to there, park under B, and then they also say when you're leaving, do you need to be validated? I'm like, I feel fine. And walk out with your parking bill is $200 because you didn't realize what they were talking about. But they did. They sent me to meet somebody, and I opened the door, and the guy was literally sitting. He was like in a closet with like just one chair. It's like, my office isn't ready yet. I think it's in fantasy, it's a good business. I think it's what's hard about it is you can work really hard on a screenplay, and in the end, you don't own it. It's not yours. You can't publish it. You can't do anything with it. It's a real gamble as a career. I think that the thing that's really nice about writing books is that it's always your book, and you don't have to do anything to it that you don't want to do it. You don't have to make the guy into a monster unless he really is. You don't have to do those things. And there's a real sense that you can make the things that you want to make, and you really are. It is a craft, whether you're writing nonfiction or a memoir or a piece of fiction. There is a real art and craft to it, and that's the fun of it too. A bit more upbeat. Revising. So anyway, so thank you, and there are books out there if people want them. I'm happy to answer more questions if people have them also.